I will be people that ready to get started? All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know we've been really looking forward to this conversation, and we're really glad to be able to share it with you. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and acknowledge that we gather on the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. Let's take a moment tonight as we talk about the land here and in this region to honor with gratitude the land and the Duwamish tribe, a people who are still here, continuing to bring their heritage to light. Acknowledging that we're on Native land is just a start. So if you're able, do consider donating directly to realrentduwamish.org to help support Duwamish outreach and cultural life. I'd also like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones, because the one time you don't do it is always the one time it will ring. And on that note, without further ado, I am very proud to turn it over to Stephen Kropp, Director of the Legacy Forest Defense Coalition.
Thank you so much. I don't think I need this. My name is Stephen Kropp. I'm going to be very quick because this night is not about me. It's about Paul and Jessica and their wonderful book. They have been kind enough to invite us to attend this book event and host it. I'm a director of the Legacy Forest Defense Coalition. We're a nonprofit organization based here in Washington State. It's focused on the protection of a rare class of older forests that we call legacy forests. And legacy forests are forests that were selectively logged, generally before World War II, and are in many cases, in many watersheds in Western Washington, the closest thing that's left to old growth forests. These are native forests. They were logged but not replanted, so they grew back on their own. And for that reason, and because of the way in which they were logging forests prior to World War II, there were no chainsaws. They had to cut everything down by hand. They had to yard things out of it by steam-powered yarders and load the logs on the rail cars. So it was a very labor-intensive process, and it was very different from the way they do things now. And for that reason, and because these forests were allowed to grow back on their own, they retain many of the biological, genetic, structural, functional legacies of the natural old-growth forests that once dominated Western Washington and now are all but gone. So it's very important that we protect our legacy forests, to protect those legacies, to protect our natural heritage, and to protect those values that are important to the indigenous people of the state. Some of these forests have significant cultural legacies in them as well, culturally modified trees that are very important to the tribes. So with that, I'm going to, I also want to say that I read Paul and Jessica's book. It's a wonderful book. I think it makes the best case for protecting these forests, the type of forests that we're focused on protecting here in Western Washington. Of any book I've read, I recommend that everyone read it who has an interest in forest ecology and conservation and is concerned about the future of our planet, because they do a great job of making the case for protecting our old growth and mature forests for climate, for the role they play in mitigating climate change. These forests are champions in our battle to combat climate change, and it's absolutely essential for many reasons, and that's one of the biggest, to protect these legacy forests and old growth forests. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lisa, and she's going to take it from here.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. So I'm Lisa McCrumman, and I'm so thrilled to be here with you all and to be here with Jessica Applegate, and welcome Jessica Applegate and Paul Koberstein, the authors of the new book, Canopy of Titans, The Life and Times of the Great North American Rainforest, which is right here. It'll be available right afterwards, and you can talk to the authors afterwards. Jessica is a managing editor and photographer for Cascadia Times, a regional environmental journal based in Portland, Oregon. She's been with Cascadia Times for 6 years and counting. Together, Paul and Jessica have written several award-winning articles on forest issues. Paul founded Cascadia Times in 1995 and has been a journalist for 4 years and has been a staff writer for the Oregonian and Willamette Week and a correspondent for Portland Tribune. In 2004, Paul won the John B. Oakes Award given annually by Columbia University for the most distinguished environmental journalism in the United States. So as I said, afterwards you can talk to either one of them, and we'll have some time for questions before you can talk to them directly. So kicking us off is Jessica is going to share an excerpt from the book.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you so much for being here. The excerpt I'm going to read is from chapter 2 from our book, and the title of the chapter is Too Good to Be True. In 2007, Richard Branson, the British entrepreneur, offered a $25 million prize for anyone inventing a device capable of removing lots of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Andy Kerr, the noted Oregon environmentalist and author, drew a picture of a tree and sent it in. But he didn't win, foiled by contest rules specifying the winner must be the inventor of such a device. Kerr didn't invent the tree, but he did have a point. Through the process of photosynthesis, trees inhale carbon dioxide, CO2, one of the greenhouse gases behind the rise in global temperatures. CO2 is 1 part carbon and 2 parts oxygen. Trees are about 1/2 carbon. They retain the carbon to make glucose and then recycle the oxygen back into the air. Living and dead trees, along with forest soils, hold the equivalent of 80% of all the carbon currently in the atmosphere. If there's one thing the planet has in abundance, it's trees. A study in 2015 by Yale University ecologist Thomas Crowther counted 3 trillion trees on Earth, 422 for each person. Without trees, life would be difficult, if not impossible. Trees are a source of food, medicine, fuel, shelter, and recreation for billions of people. In the Pacific coastal temperate rainforest, trees freshen the air with signature scents of fir, pine, spruce, and cedar. They stabilize soils, retain moisture, and filter pollution from the air and water. They cast a cooling shade over streams that are home to millions of salmon. Salmon return the favor by bringing nutrients from the ocean in an ecological feedback loop. The tree's most important task, however, may be removing carbon from the atmosphere. But it's not something a single tree does alone. The clusters of trees we call forests perform this service on a massive scale, free of charge, without complaint. They are carbon capturing machines.
Great, thank you. So you want to give us an overview of what Canopy of Titans is about?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, and you're welcome. We are journalists, not biologists or ecologists. We look at the world as journalists to report on what's going on. We don't conduct studies, but we do read studies and talk to scientists and interview people who know what they're talking about. When we started Canopy of Titans, we realized that the planet is changing, the climate is changing. We have a new normal that features more intense hurricanes, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and so on. What we wanted to know is how do we get back to the old normal, or if that's even possible. We realized that we have to stop burning fossil fuels. We have too much carbon in the air already. We can't put any more in because it is causing really devastating changes. what we discovered is that there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of carbon in the air, 300 gigatons up there, and it has to be removed. We wanted to find out what is the best way to remove that carbon. And we concluded after interviewing all these scientists, reading all these papers, that it's forests that do the job. As Jessica says, they do it free of charge without complaint, and at a scale that is far in excess of anything else that is out there. So this is a book about an exploration of an idea and adventure into this rainforest, this beautiful temperate rainforest on the Pacific coast that tells this story, which we tell this story through the lens of this rainforest, the connection between forest and climate.
And so that seemed like a lot of compelling reasons to write the book. Are there other elements to that you want to share?
I think for me personally, I grew up in rural Douglas County in Oregon, and it's a logging county. And I grew up in these beautiful forests. And over the course of my lifetime, every time I go back and visit my family, it's like more and more is gone. So I felt a personal sense of heartbreak, to be honest. And Paul and I were working together on a different project, and we traveled up to Alaska together into the Tongass to write an article about the roadless rule that then President Trump was trying to rescind, which would have given access to, so many different ancient forests up in Alaska in the name of rescinding this roadless rule. So we went up there to write that story because at that time, 6 or 7 years ago, no one was writing about it. And it was during those trips and in that field experience where we got to talk to people, all kinds of people, fishermen, everybody that depends on the forest. We realized that this really needed to be written about. And we accumulated so much material that we couldn't stop at one article. We were like, wow. So we ended up writing a couple articles, but then it took on a life of its own, and we just kind of followed it, and it turned into this book.
Yay. Thank you. I'm so glad that it turned into this book. So where is the rainforest? I sort of think of just little bits of it when I think of Washington State. So obviously that's very different.
The rainforest, of course, includes all of coastal Washington, from Cascades to the Pacific Ocean. Also in Oregon, the same territory, Northern California, Southeast Alaska, in fact, Alaska, coastal Alaska, all the way around the Gulf of Alaska to Kenai Peninsula. So it's about 25 million acres. I'm sorry, hectares. 78 million acres. It's huge. That's the size of Colorado. But it's the wet forest, the dry forest east of this region. It's a rainforest. It has an enormous amount of rain. Some of it comes down as fog. Others it comes down in snow or ice. Today in Portland, we have about 2 inches thick ice sheet over the entire city. It's a rainforest. You get wet and you get cold.
Great. Jessica, you want to share some of the journeys or, how you kind of navigated in places you write about in the book?
Sure. It was a lot of so the book was written before COVID and then during COVID and then after COVID, right? So we were all in that COVID world. So luckily we had a few trips that we were able to take, several trips. We never did make it to Vancouver, BC because everything was closed off. We've since made it there, but after the book was written, one of the most memorable experiences, I think, was traveling with Paul and a couple of scientists over the Salish Sea and Craig, Alaska, and visiting the tribal elders there, and I was pretty nervous. I had never had that experience before. It's a very small community, and we had these interviews with them, and they told us incredible stories about how people there still depend on the forest and their allotment of how many deer that they can have a year in order to survive. And the stories they told really stood out to me, and it's only by traveling to places and meeting people that we got those. I think there's a lot that you can research on the internet, but by far, the best thing I think about this book is we were actually able to go to places. One of the greatest experiences was we were flying over Prince of Wales in a bush plane, and as we were flying over, we saw this gigantic cargo ship below us, and they were loading all of these logs onto the ship, and it was right next door to the Viking lumber mill. And later when we went home, we did some research. Paul got a maritime tracking tool, and we found out that this ship was headed for China. And that same day, ironically, the owner of Viking lumber mill, or that same week, was in court testifying, saying how there just wasn't enough lumber for them to sustain their industry. And so that was just this perfect, from an investigative journalism perspective, this perfect storm of, here's the boat, we can investigate who the boat belongs to, we can map it, we have a photo. It was the little things like that we didn't plan for, but really made a big difference by doing the traveling.
Great. That sounds very revealing, and connecting the dots. You're like, how is this possible
Right.
that we're here right this second? So one of the things you said earlier, and I'd love for you to expand on, Paul, is just what's the role of carbon sequestration and forests and relating to climate and how that all works. So,
Sure. At its core, climate is a numbers game. You have numbers, the number of tons of carbon in the air, and it's about 300 gigatons, which is 300 billion metric tons of carbon, an enormous amount that's been put up there since the Industrial Revolution. What trees do is they suck that carbon out of the air and they store it in their wood, in the branches and the leaves and in the roots and the soil, forests do. And there is no other way that I know of that can do this job. I mean, the oil and gas industry is spending billions of dollars looking for a solution that is technology-based, called carbon capture and storage. And they've come up with a solution that can remove 0.1% of annual emissions and store it in carbon capture technology, which is minuscule. I mean, it's just not even worth sneezing at. Trees, on the other hand, can do this and do it really well. The problem is we're cutting our trees down. We are deforestation in the tropics, but also in the temperate rainforest. The temperate rainforest, just to give you the definition, is a forest that is in the temperate zone between the tropics and the Arctic Circle in both hemispheres, north and south. And so this rainforest in the Pacific coast is the largest temperate rainforest in the world, larger than temperate rainforests in Australia, Canada, Europe, everywhere else. And it stores more carbon per acre than any forest in the world, about 3 times more than the tropics, the Amazon, or more. And so protecting these forests, especially protecting the older, mature, and old growth forests, which store the most carbon and are growing the most rapidly, is absolutely essential. If we don't protect these trees, and Steve talked about that earlier, protecting the mature trees and the old growth trees is essential. And that's one of the main conclusions in this book.
We'll get to it later because there's a lot of myths going on about which trees are the most valuable, and old trees don't seem to be. So we can talk about that later. But first, maybe you can talk about why it's not enough to stop burning fossil fuels and the role forests play. So.
I think Paul began to touch on it, but if you think about like the Industrial Revolution, and even if we stopped doing all the bad things today, we would still have 300 gigatons of it out there because of the Industrial Revolution and just kind of this legacy. And so it really isn't, only, don't burn fossil fuels, but and we also need to do this other piece to it. So it's complementary and essential. Even if we did all the quote unquote right things and continued logging the way we are at the rate, we would not meet our emissions goals and standards.
Great. So you sort of just dropped this piece of how important this temperate rainforest is, and it doesn't seem like anybody knows about that. Part of the goal of the book is to go, hey, guess what's here right now, and maybe we should keep it while we have it. So maybe you can. Why don't we know more about this?
There is a lot of attention focused in international circles. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change under the UN has always emphasized protecting the tropics, protecting the Amazon, protecting the tropical rainforests in Africa and in Southeast Asia. But you never hear from them a word about the temperate rainforest. And these are actually, as I mentioned, store more carbon per acre than any of these tropical rainforests by far. And the reason we don't, and we quote a professor at Tufts University about this, who has been an author of about five major IPCC reports. His name is William Newmont. He said that the timber industry has really stood in the way of allowing anybody to address this. The other part of this is that the attention on temperate rainforests is really recent. We now know a lot more than we did 30 or 40 years ago about what's in these rainforests in terms of their carbon content sequestration. The first study on temperate rainforests didn't come out until 1991. And it was around that time that some groups in Oregon and in British Columbia started thinking about protecting this as a single unit, single entity, the rainforest from California to Alaska. So it's new. I mean, basically, they are not just starting to figure this out.
Well, can I add something to that? And correct me if I'm wrong, but it was almost by design that they said, look over there, pay attention to the Amazon, and let's just not look at the forest in our own backyard because this is a cash cow for us. And isn't that true? Yeah. So we found that out, and it was like, okay, because we felt the same way. Like, what? Why hasn't anybody talked about this as the forest as a whole? And it's, I think it's a divide and conquer mentality. And if you literally look at a map of Oregon and you look at the different landowners for the forest, it looks like a checkerboard. It's checkerboard land. So there's state and there's private and there's federal, and it's definitely a divide and conquer, and look over their strategies so that they can get their hands on as much timber as possible. And it's.
Let me just add one more thing. One of the first things we discovered in writing about this rainforest and researching what it's all about is that we discovered it doesn't have a name. There's no road sign that points the boundary, the direction. Rainforest starts here. There's no name. There's no boundaries or anything like that officially. in fact, the first chapter in the book is entitled "Where the Forest Has No Name," and we quote a professor at the University of Oregon who was the author of the Oregon Atlas. I asked him, "Well, what do we call it?" He goes, "That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you." We think that if this forest had a name, that people could really relate to it as something more than just an abstraction, and connect to it and work to save it. Not just, I know there's a lot of people working every day very hard to save it, but I think that more people would probably come to its behalf and say that if they knew who it was, what its name was.
I think I know you're right. I think there's that piece of, you're like, how come nobody knows about this, and where is that, and how big is it, and just the piece of like, oh, there's the Amazon. It's like, you can at least point to that. I guess I'm also really struck by all the science that is coming up and how much is being pushed back against that. There's been a lot of science that has shown how important this is, but again and again, it's almost discounted. And so I wonder if you could just address that a little bit more, because you sort of talked about it a little bit, but maybe dive into a little bit more in what you think is going on.
Wow, I mean, I'm definitely not the expert, but from what we could see, just from journalists interested in the topic, trying to figure out and answer that question, what is going on? How did this happen? Why do I drive down my family road and it's clear cuts forever? I don't understand. And it's obviously a very complicated issue, but I think at the heart of it is there is industry, and industry for a very long time has a certain playbook, and it can be the pharmaceutical industry playbook. It can be, people from the EPA. It doesn't matter. And one thing we found in the state of Washington, actually with the University of Washington, was that there are some departments where those departments hire scientists to kind of message the thing that they want people to know about. And so it's definitely a fuzzy gray area, but there's a lot of good science and there's just a lot of bad science. And unfortunately, who has the money is often the person that can afford the science to promote their ideas. And we see a lot of that. And so it kind of seeps into policy making with the whole Jay Inslee and the Biden infrastructure. We did an article a couple of years back about Jay Inslee, and the fact that everyone is pretty well-meaning, but when you're in the halls of the legislature and the lobbyists just put down their one-pagers on the desk and the legislators are busy, they have 20 bills they're trying to deal with, they want that quick and easy thing that they can read, the talking points, and then they literally go base votes on that. And so if you have a really slick message, then they're going to buy it. And it's that simple and that kind of disheartening at the same time. So that's what we're hoping to do, is to just put some good information in front of people that they can take to their legislators to help them learn a little bit more about the topic, and to not be full of lingo and everybody being afraid of science, but for people to have a hold of this, because this is our forest, and to just give it up to the scientists or to the legislators is I think maybe how we got here in the first place.
Great. So that's fantastic to be able to kind of unpack and to quickly shove it into policy and kind of move on from there. I want to follow one more with it. One of the big myths I think that's out there, and maybe you can help explain that, is there's this piece of older forests, mature forests, that some of the myths out there are that it's better to cut them all down and have younger forests because they can suck up carbon. And so I wonder if you might want to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the myths that the timber industry is fond of repeating, is that it's better to store carbon in lumber or plywood and not in the forest, because as they see it, the forest gets old, trees decay and decompose. If you keep it in, if their line is you put the carbon in the plywood, it'll stay, in there for 100 years or so. The fallacy is that only 15% of the carbon in the tree winds up long-term in these wood products. Whereas in the forest, it stays in there, 100% stays in there, and these trees keep growing forever and ever. I mean, some of these trees are 1,000 years old. In California, the redwoods are 2,000 or 3,000 years old, and they keep growing as long as they're alive. And one big old tree, in 1 year can add as much carbon as a large forest of small trees. The other part of this is that we hear a lot about tree planting, and the timber industry will say, and many other politicians will say, that if we plant trees, we can put the carbon in the trees. What they don't say is that, but those trees are going to be cut down every 40 years. That carbon is not going to stay in those trees, in those wood products. I mean, in those forests, those tree farms for very long. And even at 40 years, they don't accumulate much carbon. But a 1,000-year-old tree will store an immense amount of carbon and will continue adding more and more and more.
Yeah, along with just kind of soil that gets, I think there's a lot of carbon in the soil that gets, anyway, so lots of pieces that make that up. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the relationship of Indigenous people to the rainforest, Jessica?
Well, I certainly can't speak for anybody, but that was one of the major, I can't speak for anybody or any tribe. I am not a tribal member. But that was one of the biggest things that we really wanted to address to the best of our ability, is what is the perspective? What is the real history here? And many tribal members are alive today, of course. No one went anywhere. And so we really wanted to highlight their stories and their words within our book. And we have a personal family friend who's a Kalapuya elder. And we asked her the question. We said, what do you think about naming the forest as a whole? I mean, what is that? Is that a reasonable thing? And she looked at me and she said, hell no. Because she said a lot of cultures, the forest has so many little names depending on which tribe you're in. And we had this long, very good discussion about it. And we eventually kind of agreed that for this purpose, it would be wonderful to have a larger name. But that is a perfect example of how it's so hard to not imprint your own culture on these topics. We did our best. I'm sure we made some mistakes, but there were some incredible stories that were revealed in the book. Paul, do you want to talk about one of them? That you have a great narrative about that.
Yes, there was one family in Oregon, family members were the Kukil tribe and Coos tribe in the Oregon coast, southern Oregon coast. The great grandfather of Bundy Wasson, who was a the University of Oregon, he got a doctorate there, who wrote his dissertation about his family history. His great grandfather was one of the people who signed one of the original treaties back in the 1850s. He signed his name Kitchen to the treaty. He was actually murdered during the Rogue River Wars back in that day when the settlers came in and had a conflict with the indigenous people. His wife was captured by the U.S. Army and taken to a reservation about 100 miles north. She escaped and swam around the rocky outcrops of the Oregon coast about 50 miles south back to her home. Her son, George Wasson Sr., was a lawyer who figured out that there was a treaty called the Oregon Coast Treaty that had been signed by the U.S. government but never ratified by the U.S. Senate. He found that treaty in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution and tried to get it enforced and took it to the Supreme Court. And he was actually denied once, and then later he was successful. So his son, George Wasson Jr., wrote told this incredible story through his academic papers. We found them in the archives of the University of Oregon and wrote about it, tell the story of the Wasson family in our book. Another thing I want to talk about, although, is we had a third writer on our team, Terry Hansen, who is an enrolled member of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, a terrific journalist who actually passed away about 2 weeks before the book was published. And she wrote a chapter talking about how the communities of the Washington coast have been real trailblazers in addressing climate change and mitigating its impact on the tribal communities. And we think that was also a very important story to tell.
So we're kind of nearing the end of our time here, and we're going to get some questions from the audience, but I have a couple more questions, and one is, this whole thing is about more than trees, and it's about a forest ecosystem, and I wonder if you sort of talk about keystone kind of species in the Northwest and why they're important to the climate.
I'm gonna cough. So.
Okay. Yes, we have this rich legacy of salmon in our region, greatest salmon runs in the world. The salmon are actually a part of the climate solution. If you look at their life cycle and what they do in terms of their ecological place in the forest, in the rainforest. There's been several studies that show that trees grow faster when they're near a salmon spawning site, 3 times faster actually. And that is because the salmon brings nutrients from the ocean, and the carcass of the salmon are picked up by wolves, bears, eagles, whatever it's feeding, and will carry it into the forest where it will decompose and feed into the root system of these forests, and which are tied together by mycorrhizae fungi. And it all works together to create an ecosystem. So the salmon are not just great for eating and part of our culture and heritage. They're also part of what makes this forest important for the climate. The other part is beaver. The beaver was at one point super abundant in the coastal rainforest. They were wiped out almost completely by hunting and have recovered. But there was one study that has been duplicated several times that showed that salmon survive 3 times better in the ocean if they are, get this right, if they are in habitat that is occupied by beaver in the estuary. So these species work together to mitigate climate change, which is I was completely amazed by this.
It's so amazing. My father has some land that's in the Chehalis River Basin, and there's a series of dams, beaver dams that are there, and we were able to bring folks there and kind of found that out very, very recently. But again, it's this piece where not that many people know that. So yeah, that's interesting. So to sum it all up, what are some of the kind of solutions?
One of the feature solutions of our book, and it's funny, it wasn't until after we wrote it and had done a number of talks where we really realized how important and central the idea of what William Moomaw coined pro-forestation, and it's a word that has some key components to it. And one of the things we wanted to acknowledge is that we all use wood. Timber does create jobs. There is this reality. We are surrounded by wood as we sit here. And I think one of the brilliant things about William Moomaw and Bev Law, who also kind of coined this terminology, was they kind of had this protocol where they're saying, let trees live at least up to 80 years old. And don't just have tree farms, but allow there to be more biodiversity in the forest. And the simple, lengthen those crop rotations and really be mindful. Let's just stop logging our mature and old growth forests and legacy forests that we have left. And then we have many tree farms, as we all know. I think there's only 4%, am I correct, old growth left in the whole forest. If you think about it as a whole, that's only 4% left. So let's just leave that, focus on our quote unquote tree farms, let them do what they do. But I guess the most disturbing thing is the continual logging of mature and old growth and legacy forests, in spite of all of the science and everything that we know. And I don't want to go off on a tangent, but one of the big things is all of the wildfire mythology and how we're being told, well, we have to go in and thin these forests in order to be safe. We have to reduce fuels, do this fuel reduction. And we recently wrote an article for Earth Island Journal. No, what? Undark, yes, with MIT. And kind of really exposed that mythology. The latest infrastructure bill that gives all of this wildfire money, I think it was $50 billion. We investigated it, and it's really lining the pockets of the timber industry, but it's under the guise of thinning. And so we have to really become informed about these issues, because more and more mature and old growth trees are going every day. And I like solution-based journalism, and we really focused on that. We just didn't want to be complainers and naysayers, and I had to write about something that I knew there could be some good ideas and solutions out there. So we really dedicate the last part of the book to that. And as we say this whole time, we're not experts at all. We're regular people, but we have incredible amount of endnotes in there where we cite all of the research that we've studied, and we hope that other people go and read those primary sources for themselves. So I think there are a lot of solutions out there, and they're really exemplified in the book.
Yeah, I counted our footnotes. We have 400 footnotes in our book.
How what?
400.
Oh, footnotes. Or
Sounds-
endnotes, they're called.
Citing papers.
Mhm. I am not contagious. I don't have COVID. I've taken 3 tests. Just
Well, that was pretty comprehensive, and so I think that we have about 15 minutes or so. If you want to do some kind of questions and answers from folks in the audience.
I have a question. So you made it. I think you, Paul, made a statement that there's more carbon stored in temperate rainforest than in the Amazon. Do you know why that is, or the tropical rainforests?
Yeah, the reason is that partially genetics, and it just seems to me that trees grow faster in this region than they do in the tropics. You can just see it in the size of this tree, the trees. In the temperate rainforest here, there are 3 or 4 different tree species that grow over 300 feet. The redwood, the Douglas fir, the Sitka spruce, and another fir, I think I can't remember which one. There are several. There's only one tropical tree, and it's the yellow Meranti, which grows in Malaysia, that exceeds 300 feet. Otherwise, most trees in the tropics are 100 feet, 150 feet or smaller. So the trees are smaller, and there's a lot of course, biomass in the tropical forest, but there's just simply a lot more in the temperate rainforest.
And the density of the wood plays a big part in the biomass of the trees.
The biggest trees, of course, are the redwoods, and Douglas fir actually might have been bigger, but the bigger Douglas firs have been all cut down. It's kind of sad.
Are there anybody else have a question? Go ahead.
I have a complicated question, but not scientifically, but in terms of like society. It seems like there's been a lot of recent just passion and efforts on advocacy on urban tree canopy, and I'm just curious about the cost benefit ratio of that, and how what kind of impact we can really have in an urban setting when these are not forests, these are individual trees largely, and they're often not old forests. And is that really impacting things? Not that we shouldn't do it, but would it maybe be better to focus our efforts on the actual forests?
I saw one study, and
Urban.
I'm pretty sure about
That's
this
a good
number,
question.
about 20% of the total forest canopy in the United States is in urban forests.
20%.
So it is significant, and and there's a lot of carbon in those trees.
But I think too, I mean, they're not under threat the way our mature and old growth forests are, from what I understand. I mean, I know in our, city planning in Portland, everybody's about the urban canopy and planting trees and friends of trees. And it seems like that's pretty well known and protected. There's all these laws. I had this crazy tree in my yard and I wanted to trim it and they wouldn't let me. And, so, I mean, I think that they're almost like two different subject areas is what I think.
I don't know if I answered your question.
That's good job.
It's a good question.
Any other questions?
Forest conversion is a big problem in King County.
You want to talk more about that?
Not really.
Okay.
Come
on up.
Yeah, Stephen. come on
No,
up.
this is
perfect.
the best part when the local kind of experts come out and
I'm gonna trade
Sure,
seats.
yeah.
You can sit here.
you can use Paul's microphone. He's less.
This is actually one of Hillary Franz. Hillary Franz is our current lands commissioner, as most of you probably know. She's the head of DNR, which manages all of our state forest lands in Washington. There are about 1.6 million acres of state forest land in Western Washington. I think they're the biggest landowner next to maybe Weyerhaeuser. Yeah. And she's made a really big deal about the impacts of forest conversion on the timber industry, on our economy.
Can you tell
Yeah,
people
What's the
what?
definition of
Yeah, what
forest
does-
conversion?
What
Oh.
does that even mean?
So forest conversion is when a developer goes in and buys up a bunch of forest land and builds a new subdivision, right? So it's conversion of forest to residential, commercial, agricultural, non-forest land use. And it's not hard to understand the scope of the problem if you lived in King County for any length of time. There's been a dramatic change in the forest cover, percentage of the lowland forests in particular, which are the most productive forests, the most carbon dense forests. The rate at which those forests are being lost, and it's an ongoing problem. And she's actually done a good job of raising awareness, drawing attention to this problem, and raising money to address it. She's done a terrible job of protecting our legacy forests. And that's why we're focused, our organization, Legacy Forest Defense Coalition, right now is focused entirely on the protection of mature forests, legacy forests as we call them, that are located on state forest lands managed by DNR. These are public forest lands that are being exploited.
How
For short-term
many
gain.
acres are we talking about that we have left for legacy forests? Let's start with-
I get asked that question a lot.
The ballpark.
Yeah, so DNR likes to say, this is one of their favorite talking points anytime they're challenged on this point, that they've already protected half of all state forest lands, and set aside half of all state forest lands for wildlife conservation. First of all, it's not true for reasons I won't get into. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors behind that number. The other problem is that there have been a lot of forests, and there are a lot of older forests that are protected in Western Washington. Most of them are in federal forest lands, but there's a lot on state forests. A significant area in state forest lands are protected too, but almost all the protected forests on state forest lands are up in the high Cascades and on the west side of the Olympic Peninsula. So these tend to be less productive forests. Some of the higher, alpine forests are more scrub than forest. And meanwhile, they're aggressively logging the most productive forest lands that remain down in the lowlands. So we're really focused on those forests in places like the Lower Snoqualmie, Cherry Creek watershed, just east of Duval, the lower Nooksack, and Southwest Washington in particular has been particularly hard hit. The Chehalis River watershed, all the watersheds that drain to Willapa Bay, the watersheds that drain down to the Lower Columbia, like the Abernathy Creek watershed. These are watersheds that have really been hit hard by logging. There's not much older forest left. So that's where our focus is right now. But I don't know if I answered. I got off on a kind of a tangent
A lot,
there.
yeah, I'm gonna just.
See, there's a question back here.
Yeah, well, Hillary Clinton's running for Congress, so if she makes it all the way, what would you, and wants to address this issue, what would you want to see differently? You said she's done a terrible job of protecting legacy forests, so what would you?
Yeah. So DNR, I don't want to demonize DNR as an agency or Hillary Franz as the lands commissioner. They do a lot of things right. But there's been a real failure to protect our legacy forests.
So that would be a top priority is to actually do the protection.
Yeah. Another question I get a lot is what can we do? What can I, as a resident of Seattle or Olympia or Bellingham, what can I do to make a difference? How can I make a difference? For those of you who live in King County, probably the most important thing you can do is support our King County Council Chair, Dave Upthegrove, who's currently running for Lands Commissioner. He's a candidate. Hillary Franz, as you said, is running for Congress, so she's going to step down at the end of this year. And your King County Council Chair, his name's Dave Upthegrove.
Up the road.
Up the Grove.
Wow.
For a name.
Yeah, it does make sense.
He is running for Lands Commissioner, and his central theme of his campaign is is he wants to protect, on day one, issue a executive order placing a moratorium on logging of all legacy forests in Western Washington.
Wow.
He says this is why he's decided to run for Lands Commission. And I talked to him about this. I told him, it's great that you're saying that. It's easier said than done. But he's also been a champion for the protection of legacy forests in King County as King County Council chair. And he's played an instrumental role in stopping several timber sales that would have clear cut some of the oldest remaining and carbon dense forests on Tiger Mountain State Forest. So probably one of the most effective things that you can do, those of you who live in King County, is to write to Dave up the Grove and thank him for the work that he's done, for his advocacy, and let him know that this issue is important to you. And
Has there been any media on this
there
locally?
yes,
Okay,
yeah, there have been a number of
Good.
articles,
good.
a couple of front page articles actually in the Seattle Times
Okay.
that have drawn attention to the issue.
So I have a question that's, you're talking about preserving forests, and I realize that old growth forests are fire resistant, but there's been a lot of fires all over, everywhere in California. Even in temperate forest area, based on
Absolutely.
what you identified. How do you fight that? How do you fight those fires?
One of the
Now, based
Yeah.
on what we've done, and
So that's a huge question, and I strongly recommend if you can go to undark.org, and we recently wrote an article about that. The astounding thing that we found, so there's fires and then protecting people and homes and communities from the fire. Fire is a natural regenerative process since the beginning of time that is necessary for forest health. I think, the big hullabaloo is about all these communities living in vicinity of these big fires. You think of Paradise, for example. So we did some extensive research. We got a couple grants to study and research this for 6 months. And we found 4% of those big fires are actually caused by flames leaping down the hill. Okay, so when in your mind you think, I have this cabin on the edge of the woods, I see this fire over here, I see the smoke, we have to go put out that fire. Often 96% of the time, it is the embers that are flying through the air on the different wind patterns that can jump rivers and highways and communities that can land on a flammable surface. That's where the real damage from forest fire is coming from in terms of structures and communities. And when we study this, we realize really money doesn't need to go to thinning forests necessarily. It's both. It's not black and white, but money really needs to be given to communities to harden their homes, because it works. If you remember the fires in Maui, looking at that front page article, there was that whole block that got burned and there was that one house that was standing untouched. That was home hardening. And so there's a lot of mythology around fires and fuel reduction and thinning that is just being manipulated to go extract more from what's left of our forests. Yes, please answer.
One of the most surprising things that we found in our research was that we don't have as much fire as we used to have. Obviously, we're putting out every fire we can. And so the wildfire scientists we talk to say we don't have enough fire in our forests. Now, I know that comes to a shock to people who live near a forest and who feel vulnerable to getting burned out of their home. And fuel reduction will reduce, in theory, reduce the number of forest fires. It really won't. fires are going to leap over the thinned areas and burn wherever they land. But the problem is we don't have enough fire in these forests.
What was the Chet Hansen quote? You
You
can't,
can't fight the fire with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
You can't fight the wind with a chainsaw. So these are wind-driven fires, and they will burn. There's no way that you're going to stop them. There's no way you're going to prevent them from igniting. And really,
Unless you cut down the
we want
forest.
more fire. We don't have enough fire.
Yeah.
So I was gonna
Thinking
say,
is-
we're at a little over 7, and I know that there's sort of a container for this, so if you wanna just finish saying that, and I think then we're up, so.
Yeah, that is a quick comment. I think of it as the vaccine that treats the disease. It's kind of paradoxical to think of it in that way, but do you want the vaccine now or do you want to struggle with the COVID later? The fire, these low intensity fires are, that's the way that they're a natural part of the ecosystem, as Jessica said, and we've lost that component.
People are building homes as fast as they can in what's called the urban interface, which means the area is close or in a forest. And
It's like in a flood zone.
those are the people who are
Right,
being
exactly.
burned out, house and home, because the fire is natural. It's going to happen.
All right, I think that's kind of a wrap.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
thank you for coming.